soon as possible because they have been shown to be incredibly safe. And the nice part is if people are saying, I want to wait for a few more people to get vaccinated, we've had tens of millions of people now vaccinated around the world with these vaccines, and we found them to be incredibly safe and incredibly well tolerated. So they're going to be your best protection against COVID-19, against getting sick and dying, and that's why, again, I'm a big fan. I think they've been developed, in a proper way, and they are extremely safe overall.
Amazing. And I know you already answered some of this, but I think I'm just going to ask you to maybe dig deep a little more into, whether there's any differences in efficacy or in safety between the elderly population versus everyone else. Do we see any differences in efficacy? I know you mentioned the 95%. Is that similar also in older for older people?
Yes, so the answer is yes. So generally what we see is because as we get older, our immune systems tend to get weaker. That's why older adults in general are more prone to getting infected and having serious problems, including death from COVID-19. That's why, as Dr. Arya was saying, 95% of the deaths that have happened from COVID-19 have been amongst people 60 and older because their immune systems tend to weaken as we age, and therefore we're at greater risk of getting sick and dying from COVID-19. Similarly, when we get a vaccine, a younger person versus an older person, we find an older person's immune system, because it's not as strong, they sometimes don't develop the same level of immunity or an immune response or protection in response to the vaccine as, say, a younger, healthier person would. The good news with this type of vaccine, the technology being used, is it seems to deliver the same level of effectiveness in an older person as it would in a younger person. I think where we've seen differences, we're talking about a 95% effectiveness in a younger person and a 94% effectiveness in a younger person. We have so many other vaccines out there that we use in everyday practice that are not nearly as effective as this. So the good news is that we're seeing great effectiveness in older people. But as I mentioned before, because older people don't tend to have the same level of their immune systems aren't as strong, the good news is that people aren't developing the same side effect profile that a younger person would. Side effects, I just want to remind people, are a sign that our bodies are reacting as they should to a vaccine, that they're actually making antibodies to the vaccine. So that's a good thing if you're having some side effects. The good news is that the side effects you're likely to experience are a lot less likely than the ones that I experienced when I got a vaccine, which was really just a bit of a sore arm and a bit of fatigue. The second time I got the vaccine, I was expecting more side effects, and I really didn't have any the second time around. So again, everybody's experience is going to be a bit different, but the good news is that we see that most times these side effects are minor. They only last maybe a day or two, and we haven't seen any verified reports of significant problems from getting the vaccine amongst the tens of millions of older adults around the world that have received it so far.
Amazing. That's great. And actually, that answers a question that we got from the chat, whether there was a difference in side effects between the first dose and the second dose. So that's great to know as well. One of the questions that has come up is about the third vaccination, and I'm assuming this has to do with the Astrazeneca. Could you give us your thoughts, Dr. Sinha, about whether it's approved for the elderly or not?
Yeah, so right now we actually have two new vaccines, for example, that have been approved beyond the first two that I was just talking about, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccinations. So the other two that have just been approved use a slightly different type of technology. And when I mean technology, I don't mean machines, for example. I mean kind of the way we develop the vaccines. So the first set of vaccines that are 95% effective, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, those use what we call an mRNA technology. It's not really a technology, it's a natural molecule our bodies actually create to actually send information to cells in our body to give it instructions on how to build something like protection against a novel virus. So So it's basically using something, it's using a molecule that our bodies readily produce. It's just a synthetic type that we're using in that vaccine. And this has actually been a technology we've been using for years in looking at cancer therapies and other things. This has just been one that we've been able to use 12 years of research or more to actually use it towards a vaccine that's been incredibly successful. So that's what those vaccines are. We have two new vaccines that have been approved in Canada so far. One is the Astrazeneca Oxford University vaccine, and the other one is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And right now, the Astrazeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson, they use a different type of, again, technology, which is one that we usually use when we make things like the flu vaccine. It's called an adenovirus vaccine. It basically uses a virus with a little bit of the same information that would tell our bodies, if you will, how to build defense against COVID-19, for example. So it's a different way. And again, a lot of the vaccine makers tried different methods because we weren't sure if the mRNA approach would work. So this is what the Oxford University group and others have done. So Johnson & Johnson have created these vaccines. The AstraZeneca vaccine, like the Pfizer Moderna, is a 2-shot vaccine. The Johnson & Johnson is a single-shot vaccine, for example. Right now, the AstraZeneca one has been approved in Canada, and Health Canada has approved it, saying that it's safe in people of all ages, 18 and above, and that we know it's for sure effective in people 65 and younger. What we don't know is what our group called NACI, which actually gives advice on vaccinations, has said we don't quite have enough data from the scientific trials that were done to say if it really is as effective in older people as it is in younger people. We know it's safe, but we don't have enough data just yet to make a determination whether we'd recommend it being used in older adults right now. In countries like the United Kingdom and others where they've actually used it predominantly for vaccinating older adults, they've actually found it in what we call real world studies to be pretty effective as well. But our NACI group, which is pretty conservative, they're saying we'd love to see a little bit more data before we for sure use it for older adults, especially when we have two other vaccines which are at least 95% effective. So the AstraZeneca vaccine has been approved for people older than of all ages. But our NACI group has right now said maybe not necessarily use that just yet in older adults, although Quebec announced yesterday it will be using it in older adults, but Ontario has not said it will. The Johnson & Johnson one has been approved for use in Canada, but we're still waiting for what our NACI group is going to say. And really what may happen is NACI might say, yes, we will approve that vaccine for older adults because Johnson & Johnson, just like Moderna and Pfizer, actually enrolled a lot of older adults in their trials to make sure that we have enough evidence to say it works well in them. So right now, the bottom line is we've got 4 vaccines that are now available in Canada, and we probably will have others that will be approved over time. But we have 2 that we're currently using for older adults, and in time, we'll get more information to tell us how these other 2 might be useful and how they could be useful for older adults. But the key is there's not a shortage of vaccines. We're going to have lots of vaccines available for everybody. And right now, there's enough of the Pfizer Moderna vaccine that will be available for any older adult who wants one, for example.
Excellent. That's amazing. So, Dr. Arya, I'd like to ask you, one of the questions we get very often is in elderly who have already had COVID. And the question comes up, should they still get the vaccine? Why or why not? Could you please expand on this for us?
Yeah, so absolutely, they should get the vaccine because at this point in time, I mean, we know that there are rare circumstances where people can get reinfected with COVID-19, and we don't really know about long-term immunity once you've had the infection, right? So what that means is perhaps months from now or even longer than that, it could be that you could get COVID-19 again, and that would be a big issue. So we think that the vaccine is actually the safest way really to develop immunity against COVID-19. And the only thing is that if you recently had COVID-19 and are recovering, you have to wait until you completely recover, until you get the vaccine. And obviously, we also have to make sure that you haven't received any other vaccinations within 2 weeks.
Amazing. So switching gears a little, we also get a lot of questions from the community, whether if someone is immunocompromised, is it safe to get the COVID-19 vaccine? And we know that that's a question that comes up very often in our senior population as well. So Dr. Arya, could you give us a little more information on this?
Yeah, so as my colleague Dr. Sinha pointed out, with age, people's immune system becomes less effective, on its own. And really, I'm assuming most of Dr. Sinha's practice and my practice is, comprised of people who are older and people who have other significant comorbidities. I mean, really, the people that I see day in and day out are people who tend to be older, but also have conditions like cancer, end-stage lung diseases, heart disease, kidney failure, dementia or frailty, which makes them much weaker, and at baseline, as Dr. Sinha mentioned, makes them more likely to pick up any infection. And I would actually say that this is probably the highest risk group, that we have to get vaccinated as quick as possible and as quickly as possible. So I would actually say that these are the people that should be prioritized. From what we know, the vaccine is absolutely safe in this population. And really what we've seen in long-term care, where we had a devastating second wave, and really long-term care, once again, for everyone's knowledge, nursing homes are comprised of people who are immunocompromised in general, older adults, as I mentioned, with these sort of incurable illnesses like dementia and lung diseases and heart failure and frailty and so on. So we saw that once the vaccination rollout was completed and people had at least received their first dose, there was a remarkable sort of decline in COVID-19 deaths. Specifically, 8 weeks from December, I was just reading that basically they showed that once the vaccination started in December, 8 weeks afterwards, there was actually a 96% reduction in deaths from COVID-19. So this is great news. And this shows us that we need to roll out this vaccine as quickly as possible. We have it in our hands now, and supply is really going to become less and less of an issue. I don't think that's the problem. It's just that we have to get it in the right people's arms as quickly as we can.
Incredible. And you touched upon some really good points there. And Dr. Sin, I'd like maybe for you to expand a little on the question with respect to dementia. We also get that question very often, whether it's safe and whether those with dementia should get the vaccine. If you could give us your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, so just building on what Dr. Arya was saying, like there are a number of older people are living with at least one or more chronic conditions, and some people are living with multiple chronic conditions. So sometimes people will say, well, if I'm immunocompromised, one could be immunocompromised because they have an underlying condition that weakens their immune system. Sometimes people are on treatments, for example, they might be on steroids, or they might, for example, they might have a condition called rheumatoid arthritis, for example, where they're taking medications that will actually treat their condition, but actually weaken their immune system so that the body doesn't react negatively around their joints or other issues. So sometimes people will identify themselves and say, I'm actually taking a medication that makes me immunocompromised, or I have a condition that weakens my immune system. That's why if anybody is in that situation where they're taking particular medications, or they have a rare disease or something, and they're not sure if they would benefit or not from vaccination, as Dr. Arya was saying, basically what we're recommending is that all people, and these aren't reasons not to get vaccinated, but I certainly do recommend that if you do have a specialist who you're working with and you're not sure, reach out to them, because they can absolutely tell you whether the vaccine would be right for you. And I think 9.5 times out of 10 they'll say absolutely no worries. But that's why it's really good to check with your primary care provider or your specialist before. I think when we talk about people living with dementia, for example, sometimes people say, and they might say to Dr. Arya or myself, like with the patients that we see, are there any of your patients who probably shouldn't get the vaccine or that you wouldn't recommend the vaccine in? And I think, for example, Dr. Arya is a palliative care physician. He cares for people, including those who are right towards the end of life, for example. And if we said to somebody was actively dying, may have only a few weeks to live, for example, example, or even a month or two to live, that's a person where we might say, well, really, I mean, the vaccine is one that, it's done, over a number of weeks, if you will. This person may not even be alive by the end of it. And I don't know if this will necessarily be of benefit to them. I'm going to let Dr. Arya talk about that a little bit further. But I think certainly, if a person has dementia, for example, we do absolutely recommend them getting vaccinated. And I'll explain why. I think right now we know that that people with certain types of conditions, are at greater risk of getting COVID-19, and in fact, people living with dementia are a much higher risk of getting that. And dementia, basically, for people who aren't familiar with the term or the concept, basically it means that it's a person who's got memory or thinking problems that are interfering with their ability to do their daily tasks, for example. And sometimes it's remembering that we're in a pandemic, that I should be wearing my mask. I should be physically distant from other people. And sometimes people who aren't even aware or don't know about those things might accidentally be interacting with other people, not wearing their mask, which puts them at risk and puts others at risk as well. They may not remember to wash their hands and maintain good hand hygiene, for example. So all of those are reasons. And as Dr. Arya will tell you as well, 90% of the people living in our long-term care homes, for example, have cognitive impairments, and about 60 or 70% are living with dementia. But the majority of people living with dementia are out in community, are living with their family members and friends as well. And that's why we highly recommend that these individuals, amongst older people in general, definitely do get vaccinated, because again, it gives them protection, especially when they're at greater risk of getting infected and dying from the disease. Another common question that comes up is, wait a minute, but if I do get the vaccination, might that actually might that worsen someone's confusion, for example, or may that make their memory worse? Because if they have a side effect, for example, could that actually trigger some problems for them? And generally what we say is, absolutely, a person might, for example, have a sore arm, they might have a headache, they might have a little bit of a fever. That could sometimes trigger confusion, just like a urinary tract infection or pneumonia can trigger confusion. But again, we have treatments for those sorts of things. If someone has a headache or a bit of a fever, you can give them something like acetaminophen or Tylenol, which can help decrease those symptoms and maybe less and decrease the concern about them, being agitated or potentially having more confusion. So really, there are no real contraindications or reasons why we would say a person with dementia shouldn't get the vaccine. In fact, we'd highly recommend the person get the vaccine because they're at greater risk of getting sick and dying from COVID-19.
Yeah, that is such a great and important point to make as well. Dr. Arya, I'm going to ask you a question that just came up in the chat over here, but there's a question on whether the COVID vaccine can give you COVID, and can you pass on COVID to someone else if you've gotten the COVID vaccination?
Yeah, so what we know, I mean, the initial data when Dr. Sinha and actually Dr. Sinha mentioned this risk, we know where the vaccine is 95% effective. That's referring to the risk of, sort of getting COVID-19, but not to the risk of transmission. But, that's what we knew early on. And since that data has come out, we're really seeing that the vaccines significantly lower the risk of transmission. They lower the risk of asymptomatic spread, which is what we expected. And what that means is that, we know with COVID-19, about half of people can have the virus and transmit it to others without any symptoms. And that's part of the reason it's so difficult to contain. And infection control measures, public health measures are so important, have always been so important through this pandemic. So specifically when we're talking about the vaccine, it will lower the risk, but it doesn't eliminate that risk. So at this point in the time, when we're still sort of in phase 1 of the vaccinations, we still haven't completed people living in retirement homes. We're just starting people who are over 80, and there's many, many other groups that are at high risk if they were to get COVID-19. It's very important for all of us to follow those public health measures. But once again, the vaccine is absolutely effective. We should make sure that we vaccinate as many people as possible, starting with high risk groups as quickly as possible. And it will lower the risk of death. It will lower the risk of getting COVID-19 and so on.
Amazing. And Dr. Sinha, question for you. I know you were taking us through the mechanism of action or how these vaccines work. Could you also perhaps tell us a little about how the vaccine does not have a live virus in it as well, and so it cannot actually cause COVID infection in someone?
Yeah, because I think a lot of people are worried. They're saying, okay, well, how are you protecting me from, like, it's called the COVID-19 vaccine. Does that mean it actually has COVID-19 in it? And are you giving me the virus, and then you're getting me to fight the virus, and that's how I have an immune response? And I think it's an excellent question. The key is nobody can get COVID-19 from any of the vaccines that are out there, because none of the vaccines available, depending on the types of technology, actually have like the actual alive COVID-19 virus in. So it's not like we're injecting people with that. What we are really doing is, with each of the types of vaccines out there, is we're actually giving enough information to the body to actually help develop an immune response to COVID-19. So for example, the mRNA vaccines, that's the technical term for the as I said, the word technology, for what's behind the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. They're using a molecule in our body that really is what we call messenger RNA, which means messenger ribonucleic acid. It's a molecule, and our body uses it all the time to send messages to cells in our body, to give it instructions to do various things. And in this case, for example, what scientists have been able to do is make a synthetic version of that. And really, it has a little bit of instruction manual that says, if this is the overall virus itself, it's like, let me just say this is the virus, and there's this thing called the spike protein. It's this very distinguishing feature. It's kind of like the mustache on a person, right? It's that very distinctive thing. You know what that mustache looks like. Well, it basically tells the body, recognize that mustache. You see that mustache? That tells you that that's COVID-19. So it basically allows, it actually sends the information around what that looks like, that mustache, if you want to use it, or that spike protein. And that way, it allows the body to start building what we call antibodies or protection, so that if the body does actually if our bodies come into contact with COVID-19, and they're like, wait a minute, that's COVID-19. It has that spike protein that I've been trained to recognize. It's that mustache. I know that person, for example. Then that's actually how the body gets trained to create immune response to that. Similarly, the Astrazeneca, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they use a weakened virus called an adenovirus, for example, that has a little bit of the information related to the COVID-19 one. So again, it doesn't give you anything that actually grows inside of you or does anything different. It basically gives you instructions so that your body then has enough information to make a defense against that vaccine, against the virus, if it does get it. So that's kind of the technology behind how these vaccines work, and many vaccines work exactly in the same way. So it's and some vaccines work by giving you a weakened form of the virus or a dead virus, for example. In this case, basically, we're giving some instructions related to the virus in these different types of vaccines that are available, that then help our body create the protection it needs to in case it comes in contact with that virus overall. So hopefully, Savina, you will tell me if I did an okay job with that. If I didn't, Dr. Arya probably can explain it better than I just did.
No, I think that was great. I was very thorough, and I think it really explained how the vaccine works really well. I love your mustache analogy, and I'm going to use it because I think it's such a great way of explaining it. So thank you. Really love that. Dr. Arya, there's a question in the chat with respect to taking either Tylenol or other NSAIDs. Can we take that after you get the vaccination? Is there a difference with respect to taking it before versus after? If you could give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so as Dr. Sinha has explained, it's important for us to have that immune response in order for the vaccine to be as effective as possible when we receive it. And side effects like, you know, a mild headache or rarely a slight fever, but usually not. I mean, a sore arm, fatigue for a day or two are the signs that the vaccine is actually working. So we suggest that, you know, you can take acetaminophen or Tylenol afterwards for some of those side effects, but not before, because it's important that your immune system is kind of ready to go. And that's really important, of course, to make sure the vaccine is as effective as possible.
Amazing. And I know there's a lot of questions that are coming with respect to the vaccine, but I also really just want to go into talking about the rollout, because that's been on top of mind of all of our communities. So let's talk a little bit about the rollout first, and then maybe come back to vaccines if we have some time towards the end. So perhaps, Dr. Sinha, maybe I can start with you. Could you give us an idea about when seniors in our communities can expect to receive the vaccination? And also, could you talk a little more about the age breakdowns, and how would people know when it's their turn? How will they be informed?
No, it's a great question. So right now, the first piece is that we have enough vaccine that's been ordered. Literally, Canada has bought 10 doses for every Canadian that actually exists. So there's a lot of vaccine that's available, and now it's starting to come in large amounts. So that's the good news. That's number one. Now there's and originally the plan was for us to have enough vaccine shipped to Canada so that everybody who wanted a vaccine would be able to get it by September. In Ontario, the government is now moving and accelerating its plan to get people vaccinated so that basically every adult who would like a vaccine should be able to get it by June. So that's really good news that we've been able to speed up the process. And that's by making sure that everybody can get at least their initial dose of the vaccine, in the coming months. So what we've basically done is we've tried to focus on getting those first doses to the people at greatest risk. And as Dr. Arya was saying, that's largely been, frontline workers, for example, who are working in hospital settings. So like myself and Dr. Arya, who've been working in what we call our COVID wards, or working in emergency departments or on inpatient wards where we might come into that. So those sorts of frontline workers, for example, but also our oldest people, and especially those who are most vulnerable. So a real focus at the very beginning was vaccinating people living in our nursing homes. We're now currently completing vaccinations in our retirement homes, for example. There's a focus that will occur shortly and around older people who are receiving home care, because again, they're coming into close contact with lots of people. And so we want to make sure they're vaccinated. And already what the government has talked about is starting to get people vaccinated who are 80 and older, for example. That's the first, broad priority group, if you will, based on age alone. So what we know right now is some public health units have a little bit more vaccine available than others, or been able to vaccinate their priority populations first. So they've been able to already start vaccinating people 80 and older. And I know in the city of Toronto now, there's a website called vaccineto.ca. I went on it earlier today, and again, it lists you all the hospital groups in the city of Toronto that are offering vaccination. But certainly in Peel, Peel region, for example, in York region and in various regions, it's important to understand who your public health unit is and what their strategy is, because certainly some units have already started vaccinating their older adults, but by March 15th, we should apparently have a provincial website and a phone line available where, again, if you haven't been able to register yourself locally through your local public health unit or through a local hospital that you receive services through, everyone in Ontario who's 80 and older will be able to start registering on a provincial website to be able to register and then book a vaccination appointment. And I'm really pleased that already this past week, and even starting last week, many of my older patients who are older than 80 years old are getting their vaccinations. So that's good news. What we know is that during the month of April, we should start seeing people younger than 80 quickly get vaccinated. So people who are and we're going to start going in 5-year increments. So the next group will be those 75 to 80, then those who are 70 to 75, and then those who are 65 to 70, in that fashion. It'll go down year by year, in that way. And we also know that those who are caregivers to, say, an older person, for example, will be eligible to be able to be vaccinated, including, as Dr. Arya was mentioning, even younger people, adults, for example, who have a chronic health condition that might put them at risk. So the key thing is to check in to understand, what is your local public health unit? Is it, for example, Peel Region? Is it York Region? Is it Toronto? Go to their website, because that's where you're going to get some clear information. And if they are accepting vaccinations for people to register or even get vaccinated, that's what's going to happen. And the key is, if you don't register, then you're not necessarily going to get an appointment. So it's making sure. If you're not sure, reach out to your primary care doctor, for example, or your healthcare provider, because they might be able to direct you to where you might be able to get a vaccine. Certain pharmacies, we're going to start rolling out the vaccine, the Astrazeneca vaccine, to people who are 60 to 65 starting next week as well. So again, there's going to be a lot of information that's coming through, but I would say check with your local public health unit first, so that you know. And that way you'll know how you can register, how you can put your hand up. And certainly if you're a home care client, your home care provider should be getting you information on when you can be vaccinated. And especially for those who are homebound, who can't get out of their home easily for a vaccine, I do know that in Toronto and other regions, they are looking at, how do we make sure that we can bring the vaccine to those people who wouldn't readily be able to come to a clinic, or come to a pharmacy to get a vaccine. So I think if you're genuinely interested, there's no time like today to look up that information so that you can understand where that'll be. But generally, I think anybody 65 or older should probably be able to get vaccinated by April or May, even at the latest, for example. So that's the good news, for older people in our community right now.
Amazing. That's so exciting to hear. Dr. Arya, could you give your perspective? I know that Dr. Sinar talked a little about how the process is in Toronto. We have a very large community that's joining us today that is from Peel. And so it's one of those questions that has been coming up a lot, even from our Peel communities, to understand, what the process is in Peel. Where do people go get their vaccinations? We're hearing a lot more about the Toronto-based vaccination sites, not as much about Peel. So could you give us some idea about that? And also, could you talk to us about whether we can start getting them at our family physicians at some point as well? It'd be great to get your perspective as well.
Yeah, so absolutely, I can share some information, as I currently at this time work in the region of Peel. As Dr. Sinha sort of outlined and spoke about, it's really the public health units, the local public health authorities who are coming up with the next phase of the vaccine rollout and assisting with this. So specifically with Peel, I encourage everyone to go to their website, which is peelregion.ca /coronavirus/vaccine. /vaccine, which kind of can tell you about sort of where to go and what are the specific links about where to get the vaccine. So I hope we can share that link with everyone. Specifically in Brampton, it's William Osler Health System, the local hospital, which is offering the vaccine. It'll be offered really at 3 places. Sort of one is the Community Health Center, Chinguacousy Health Center. So that's for Brampton. For health, and that's for older adults at this time, people over 80. For people over 80 who live in North Etobicoke, it's Etobicoke General Hospital. And then for health workers, they can still go to Brampton Civic Hospital and book an appointment if they want to. So that's something you consider. And similarly, Mississauga Trillium Health Partners has their own process, and they're offering the vaccine at their hospital, Mississauga Hospital, or at University of Toronto, Mississauga campus. So I encourage you to go to their website and book an appointment. I will add that, for the Osler site, they have free parking, so you don't have to worry about parking. And they have a phone number as well. If sort of being on the internet is a little bit difficult, or navigating the website is a little bit challenging, then they have a phone number so that you can get this booked.
Amazing. And, I live in a multi-gen housing myself, and my father, who's high risk, lives with me. And I was already testing at the website. He's not 80 plus yet, but he will be soon. So, my fingers are ready to go to make him that appointment to get his vaccination and get him safe. That's incredible. So actually now what I'm going to do is welcome Anmol Gill. Thank you so much for waiting so patiently. Anmol is an incredible community ambassador with Punjabi Community Health Services over here, and she's been doing such great work with the community. And what she's done today is actually collated a couple of questions that have come in from the community. And Anmol, if you could please introduce yourself, and then also please ask your questions to our speakers today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really insightful, and I'm glad to be here with you guys to share a little bit of what we've been seeing on the ground and questions that have been coming up. So background again about myself. My name's Anmol. My background's in public health. I recently graduated with my master's. And as Sabina said, I work with Punjabi Community Health Services as a community ambassador. So this is part of like the larger picture Ontario high priorities community strategy. So we're one of the many lead agencies that's doing this kind of work all across, the GTA and other parts of Ontario. So a lot of the work that we do is connecting people who are getting tested to the wraparound supports that they need and often didn't have access to before. So financial assistance, grocery delivery, food, hot meals, mental health support, and many others. A lot of the work that we do also involves community outreach. So talking to individuals and kind of answering any questions or concerns that they have about COVID-19, about testing, and as of late about the vaccines. So one of the questions that we often get is, how is this COVID-19 vaccination different from the flu shot that people would normally get year to year?
So
yeah, sure.
No worries. So I think the flu shot that so people say, if I get the vaccine, if I got the flu vaccine, am I protected against COVID-19? And if I get the COVID-19 vaccine, does that protect me against the flu? Mm-hmm. So we really think about these as two very different viruses. So influenza is the type of virus, or the influenza virus is really what causes the flu, if you will, every year. And every year there's different strains of the influenza virus that give us that seasonal flu. And that's why it's important that every single year we actually get the flu vaccine, because it's developed for what was circulating in terms of influenza viruses that year. The COVID-19 vaccine has specifically been developed against the virus, the coronavirus, that type of virus that causes COVID-19. And the key is, it's always important, just as we're talking about it, these two different types of viruses, is to remember that there are many infectious agents that can put older people at risk. Tetanus, pertussis, or whooping cough, for example. We think about shingles, for example, or what we call herpes zoster. So we talk about influenza, and now we're talking about the coronavirus, for example, or the virus that causes SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19. And so it's really important that while you're thinking about getting the COVID-19 vaccine, that you might want to also have a chat with your primary care provider. Say, by the way, am I up to date on most of my other vaccinations? Because, for example, we want older people to be vaccinated against pneumonia, influenza, tetanus, and shingles, for example. And most older adults are not fully vaccinated against all the other things they aren't. But the good news is that most older adults are really excited about the COVID-19 vaccine. But I'm trying to remind people that there's probably a lot of other vaccines that you should be taking as well, that could also save your life, that you may not even be aware that you're missing at the moment. So I hope, Amol, did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I think understanding that they're two kind of completely different vaccines, and the point that you brought up about vaccinations in general, I think it's a good move to get people, just a reminder, I guess, in general. Yeah. Another question that we often get is that we've heard that some people can still get COVID. I know this was mentioned a little bit earlier too, that you can still get COVID after you get the vaccine. So why does this occur, and why should we still get the vaccine if you can still get COVID?
Yeah, so maybe I can answer that one. Yeah, as we were kind of discussing before, the vaccine is effective at sort of lowering your chance of getting COVID-19 across the board, and we're now getting more and more data that shows that it reduces your risk of spreading COVID-19. But the outcome that we're really interested in, that really matters, is it dramatically reduces the risk of hospitalizations from COVID-19. So even if there is that small risk that maybe you could get COVID, you're less likely to end up sick in the hospital. You're less likely to have a severe version of COVID-19. And what we're seeing from the data, whether it's the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, AstraZeneca, or Johnson & Johnson, what really shows us that the science is working, and really any of these vaccines would be appropriate, although for reasons that we talked about, Pfizer and Moderna are probably preferred in older adults. Is that the risk of death almost goes down to zero after you get the vaccine. I mean, pretty much it is zero after you get the vaccine. And that's the outcome we all care about, right? We don't want anybody to get very ill with COVID-19, and we don't want people to die from COVID-19.
And just to build on Dr. Arya's comments, I mean, he and I and Sabina are all very active on Twitter, and I know one of the things that we like is there's this great chart that we've all seen where it shows how many tens of thousands of people have been enrolled in all the different variety of vaccine trials. And the one common element to all of them, when people say, is one vaccine better than the other? Well, they've all been effective in that fact is that not a single person in these vaccine trials has ended up not only dead, but not a single person has ended up in hospital. So that really talks about why we really want to protect ourselves and each other, by getting these vaccines, is because that's fundamentally it. We do know that sometimes, for example, that some of these vaccines may not be as protective against some of these new variants coming out. But what we're seeing is when people do get infected, for example, if they do get infected with a different variant, for example, that what they're seeing is a very, very mild illness, if anything. And that's basically what you want. You want to have something that's a little bit of a sniffle, as opposed to potentially ending up in hospital and ending up dying. So that's why we're really talking about importance. The other thing is, when we talk about 95% efficacy, it doesn't mean it works in 95 people 100%, and it works in and it doesn't work in 5 people. We're basically saying that overall, for everybody, it gives everybody a certain, significant degree of protection, but we don't know which person might still get infected. And if they are to get infected, as Dr. Arya was saying, is that really what we're not likely going to see is a severe illness, one that could land you in hospital or kill you. And that's really the good news with the vaccine.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
And I wanted to add one more point quickly that really I think I wanted to get across, and Dr. Sinha mentioned it, but I think it's important to say at this point. We're talking about, there's naturally fears about the vaccine that we're here to address and talk about. But I think the number one question that I've used when I'm talking to, my patients and their families, who are honestly asking daily about when they're going to get the vaccine, is what's the risk of no vaccine? Right. And I really think that's the big question, right? The risk of getting no vaccine, as we've outlined, is ending up in the hospital and suffering and dying. And I can share with you, even if people don't die, especially for people who are, for older adults, people who have many other comorbidities, as is common for, Dr. Sinha and my practice, these are people who are more likely to, they're very sick afterwards. Their function has declined, and they may be dependent on other people when they weren't before. They may be more bedbound or dependent on oxygen for even weeks or months ahead, is what I'm seeing, and that's something that we all want to prevent.
The other thing, just to build on what Dr. Arya was saying too, is sometimes people might say, well, what's the risk of not getting vaccinated, period? But also some people might say, isn't it healthier to have a natural infection, for example? So if I just get, I saw my grandson, he got COVID, he had a little bit of a cough, it wasn't too big, so, I'm pretty healthy, I'll be fine as an 80-year-old. I just have a bit of hypertension and or high blood pressure, and that's about it. I should be fine. The key is, what we know is that for older people who do get COVID, it can end up being much more, your risk of having a serious illness and dying is that much greater compared to a younger person. For a young, healthy doctors like Dr. Arya and myself, our chance of dying from COVID-19 is less than 1%. For one of our patients in their 90s, it's about 25%. So it just gives you a sense of how much a greater risk an older person is. In terms of the idea that, is it better to actually get the vaccine or have a natural infection, for example? Or I had COVID-19, do I need to get it? Do I need to get this, the vaccine still? As Dr. Arya was mentioning, that we don't know with great certainty is how protected you will be. Depending on how ill you were, for example, it might tell us how strong an immune response your body created. We don't know how long that immune response will last, for example. But when you get an immunization, you have a much more consistent and effective response from the vaccine. And it's a much safer way to build up that immunity than take a trial with an infection and see what happens there. So that's why some people say maybe it's better if I just don't do anything, or if I get infected, I'll see what happens, or maybe that's better. Or even if I did have an infection and I recovered, still very good advice to get the vaccine so that you know that you truly do have good, solid protection, from something that's a safe and well-tolerated vaccine.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that bit about the risk of no infection, no vaccination is a really key point that we should continue to bring up when we talk to people in the community. And I have one last question. So as people do get vaccinated, what kind of happens after people get vaccinated? Are we able to see our friends and our family? How should one go about, especially when it comes to like PPE, et cetera? If you could just speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, so I can start. So some people may have seen on the news yesterday that the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta just released some new guidance and kind of some advice for people once they are fully vaccinated. So remember that if you're on a 2-step vaccine, for example, and the 3 ones that are available right now are all 2-step vaccines. After you get your first dose, you have some protection, but not what we'd say full protection. So you might be 50 to 80% protected, but not that 95% level of protection that you'll get after you have your second dose. So really what they're saying is after you receive both doses, 2 weeks after, for example, if Sabina and I have both been fully vaccinated, and 2 weeks after that, we probably now can meet face to face without wearing face masks, and together, for example, within 6 feet of each other, and be able to have a conversation or do those things, for example. And so that's what the CDC is recommending. We don't have any formal advice, for example, from the Public Health Agency of Canada or our local public health units or authorities on what we should do. But the one key reminder there is that, for example, if I was vaccinated now, and I was visiting my grandfather, for example, again, the question is, if there are people around you, for example, who haven't been vaccinated, for example, if they're young and healthy, it may be okay to not wear your mask and to interact with them. But if they're an older person, for example, if it's my grandfather, the recommendation is you should still wear a mask in those circumstances, because the risk that you could still potentially pass along the virus to them, and if they get the virus, the potential that they could get seriously ill and die is a consideration. So right now, we're not basically saying that once you're vaccinated, fully vaccinated, you can stop doing your precautions. The recommendation is when you're out in public, for example, you should still wear a mask. You should still physically distance. You should still be washing your hands. But in gatherings in your household, if you're gathering with other people who are fully vaccinated and protected, if you will, then you probably can not have to use all the same precautions we would say that you would use if you're meeting with strangers or people who are potentially vulnerable from getting infected as well. So the goal is that, the CDC is recommending that, for example, for an older set of grandparents or a grandfather who's now fully vaccinated, they probably could safely meet with their grandkids. They could probably hug them too, which is really exciting once you get the vaccine, for example. But again, that guidance is stuff that is just being developed. Hopefully we'll have some similar guidance in Canada, but it just reminds us that we're not completely out of the woods, and that we have to still make sure that we're following the public health guidance that our public health units are offering right now, which is still wear a mask, still physically distance, do the right things. But hopefully once enough of us get vaccinated, life will return, kind of to what normal was like before.
Oh man, can't wait for life to be somewhat normal. And I know that my toddler is waiting to see his grandma. So I think that, once we are all vaccinated, we can't wait to actually see some of our family members. We have a couple more questions. If we could maybe go another 5 minutes. I know we're a little past time. But one of the questions that's come up, and maybe Dr. Arya, I could pose this to you. How long will the immunity last from the COVID vaccine? Is it something that's going to be given yearly or not?
Yeah, so I think we're still awaiting data on sort of the answer to that. Right now, we know that, for example, in Canada, December 14th was the first day pretty much that the vaccine started to go into people's arms. And we're still doing very good, right, in terms of preventing this virus from spreading further in people that we vaccinated, for example, in long-term care, where, as I mentioned, there's been a remarkable, turnaround once we got the first doses in people's arms. By people, I mean health workers and residents. So, we're hopeful that this will be something that will last a while, but with the variants on the horizon, I'm hearing from, research and other circles that there may be sort of another booster shot that could be offered later, later on in the, later on down the road. And yeah, it could be possible that it may be something yearly as well, but right now it's too preliminary to say.
Yeah, that is, unfortunately, we only have so much data so far, but time will tell on that front. Dr. Sinha, could you talk a little about the 4-month delay for the second dosing that I believe NACI recently had recommended, and what's the basis for that?
Yeah, so right now, people might have heard, like, wait a minute, I heard that these vaccines, for example, like the Pfizer vaccine, there's a 21-day interval, for example, that was established in their trials. And with the Moderna vaccine, I believe it was a 28-day interval that was done. And now people are saying, wait a minute, I heard that at one point there was advice to maybe even delay the second dose by up to 42 days. And now we're hearing actually that you can delay it up to 4 months or 16 weeks. Like, what's going on there? Who's making these rules, for example? And the first thing is, right now, people are saying, is that wise? Is that smart to do? Because Pfizer, for example, have said, we advise you just to do what the study said, which was 21 days. What we routinely see is actually when we're giving vaccines, and especially two-step vaccines, for example, often we have to recognize that when you get your first dose, your body starts mounting an immune response. And over time, for example, the longer you wait, the stronger that response gets, for example, number one. And that booster that you get down the road, for example, it really kind of boosts that final response, if you will, to get you up to that 95%. So really, part of the strategy, and it's not uncommon in some cases, where we would say that the longer you actually wait to get that second dose, for example, the overall stronger the overall immune response you develop is, and even the longer the level of protection you actually have. That's kind of traditional, much smarter people than me who are very much into development of vaccines have explained this to me. And I thought that was very helpful for me to understand, because I was wondering about, what about this dosing? Like, I would say, if this is how they tested it and they tried it, then this is what we should do. But traditionally, vaccines, can actually be given, at longer and longer intervals. The key is what we're trying to do, or the strategies that were used in countries like Britain, is they said when there was a lot of coronavirus circulating, their strategy was saying, if we actually vaccinate 100%, so all the population with a vaccine that within a few weeks can give everybody 80% protection, versus vaccinating half the people who get 95% protection and the other half that have no protection, for example, what will save more lives, and what will actually significantly reduce the rate of serious illness and death? And really, the strategy that was used in England, where they didn't have enough vaccine at the beginning, was they just said, give everybody a first dose, as many people as first dose. And that was something that worked remarkably well, because with the vaccines that were available, they saw that people had about 80% protection. And that was enough protection, if you will, to really lower the risk of illness and death. And now, of course, they're going to be giving everybody their second doses as well. But they found that they could safely delay, and that was a technique that worked well. The goal here right now in Canada is if we gave everybody the two-step approach, for example, we could be waiting into the fall. And right now we're really trying to race to get everybody at least an initial dose, especially with this third wave that people have been hearing about, that we're concerned about. And so that's partly why the government in Ontario and most other governments across the country are now are adopting a British model, where they're saying we're going to try and give everybody by June 21st, or the first day of summer, I understand, a first initial dose. And then we'll make sure that everybody gets their second dose, and we can wait, we can delay as much as the 16-week period. But I already know that some of my patients, for example, I'm asking them, hey, you just got your vaccine, when's your next date? And they said, well, I was just told 21 days from now. So it's great. So I think right now what we're doing is we're given permission to delay the dose. If you're told that your dose is going to be 5 weeks or 6 weeks from now, I wouldn't panic, because again, we're using the science and the evidence that we have to make good educated guesses. And really, it's not about being shortchanged, and it's not one way is the right way to do it. In fact, actually, a delay might be an absolutely healthy and worthwhile thing to do as well.
That's amazing. And okay, so Dr. Arya, I'm going to leave the last question for you. And this one is going to be an interesting one, because I think it's also another one that's top of mind for everyone. What, in your opinion, is the best vaccine? Is there such a thing? And do people have, would people have the option or the choice to choose which vaccine they want?
Yeah, so we're early on in the rollout. I mean, we're not at the point like, that other countries like the US or, for sure Israel is pretty much leading the world in terms of vaccination. Like, we're not at that point yet. So at this point in the pandemic, where we still have many sort of vulnerable people, high risk populations who have not been vaccinated, essential workers, older adults, people who live with disabilities, and so on. It's very important that, we all think about this and we really consider that the best vaccine is the one that's offered to you. Really, there's no other way to talk about this. And as Dr. Sinha and I have explained, it's really all these vaccines lower the outcomes that we care about, which will get us out of this pandemic. So basically, all these vaccines are successful at, dramatically reducing or bringing down to almost zero the chance of ending up in a hospital with severe COVID-19 illness. And they will pretty much eliminate the chance of dying from COVID-19. And that's what we need. And it's a reminder to everyone that, we have the ticket actually out of the pandemic, right? That's what vaccines are about. And it's really a miracle of science that, a year ago, this was an unknown virus. And now we vaccinated long-term care, we're vaccinating many other populations. And I'm really hopeful that, as Dr. Sinha was also talking about, the CDC guidance, where we're seeing, families being reunited. And I'm sure many of us are in those scenarios as well, where, I can share, I haven't seen my parents in Vancouver in over a year, because we're both scared, and my parents are both over 80 and anxiously waiting to get vaccinated. And I'm going to help them to book it in Fraser Health and in the Vancouver region very soon. But there's many sort of circumstances like that where people are not seeing their parents and grandparents, and they're scared. We haven't had sort of what we would call normal life, where we can travel, attend weddings and other functions. So I'm really hopeful that later on this year, we'll start to see some return of that life, which is very important. We have the ticket out of the pandemic.
We do, we absolutely do. And what a great note to end on. Dr. Arya, Dr. Sinha, thank you so much for being here with us today. I can't begin to thank you enough, how incredible this entire conversation has been. And thank you for giving the guidance and answering all of our community's questions. We truly appreciate having both of you here on with us today. So thank you so much for being here today. I really, truly, from the bottom of my heart, appreciate both of you and the time that you've given our communities today. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And just quick note before we wrap up, we do have one last announcement to make before I close up. Our next town hall is going to be on Thursday, March 18th, and we're going to have Dr. Nahid Dastani, who's a palliative care physician, and Dr. Abdul Sarkavi, who's infectious diseases specialist at UHN, going to be back here to answer all of your questions. And this session will be also available in live interpretation in Hindi. And after this, we have 3 others that will be for Spanish speaking, for the Black community, as well as for the South Asian community with other South Asian languages. And with that, the last slide here is just our URL if you want additional questions. If there are questions that we didn't get to today, unfortunately, because of time, please do email us. We'll try and get back to you as soon as possible with answers. We also have a lot more materials that you can take a look at on our website, and they might also hopefully answer your questions. So with that, thank you so much for being here tonight with us. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Anmol. Your wisdom and your insights from the community have been such a tremendous help with us. And the Community Ambassador Program, I mean, you know, our foundation has supported them across GTA, and I can't even begin to thank you and all the incredible work that you and your colleagues are doing. So thank you so much for being here with us, Anmol.
No worries. Thank you so much.
Great. So thank you, Dr. Arya, Dr. Sinha. Thank you, Anmol, and have a good evening, everyone.